Elizabeth Rosemont Taylor was born February the 27th, 1932, in the outskirts of London, England, into a prominent family. Her parents were both Americans from Kansas. They had moved to England in 1929. Mr. Taylor, Francis Lynn, was a prominent art dealer, and he was owner and operator of an art gallery in London. Her mother, Sarah Viola, was a stage actress. Elizabeth had one older brother, Howard, born 1929. Elizabeth held dual citizenships, British and American. And young Elizabeth was born with scoliosis that will cause her pain and problems her entire life. In 1939, when Elizabeth was 7, the American ambassador to Britain, Joseph P. Kennedy, father of the future President John F. Kennedy, will ask Francis Taylor to move his family back to the United States for their safety, as war clouds were looming in Europe. Sarah and her 2 children will return to California and move in with Francis's father in Pasadena, while Francis stays in London to close his gallery. He returns to the U.S. in December of that same year, and in 1940 he opens an art gallery in Los Angeles, and the family moves to Beverly Hills. The art gallery had a clientele of movie actors and producers, and they arranged for 8-year-old Elizabeth to have a screen test because of her striking blue eyes. She was offered a short-term contract with Universal through her parents' connections. And in 1942, at the age of 10, Elizabeth Taylor got her small part in There's One Born Every Minute. The next year, her contract with Universal was terminated. Her casting director said that she did not have a kid's face and she spoke way too direct for a child. After losing her contract with Universal, her dad asked his friend, MGM producer Samuel Marks, if she could audition for MGM. It just so happened that they were looking for a young actress with a British accent to play opposite Rowdy McDowell in Lassie Come Home. She got the part, and the 2 young actors became great friends for the rest of their lives. That same year, she had a small part in Jane Eyre that starred Orson Welles and Joan Fontaine. A year later, in 1944, it was The White Cliffs of Dover, starring Irene Dunne and with Elizabeth's friend, Rowdy McDowell. These were filmed during World War II, and they utilized her British accent. Also in 1944, at the age of 12, Elizabeth Taylor will star in her first lead role, National Velvet. Although she was only 12, she became the studio's most popular teenage star. Unfortunately, during the filming of National Velvet, Elizabeth broke her back, and although she suffered with severe pain, it was not discovered until some years later. Here she is with her co-star, Mickey Rooney. Taylor said that she had no childhood. Working at the studio was like working in a factory. They had a strict schedule, and when she wasn't attending school on the studio lot, she was filming. And in the afternoons, it was practicing dancing or singing or studying lines for the next day's shoot. By 1947, when Elizabeth was 15, the studio started cultivating her image as a young woman. Now this is Elizabeth in 1947 with her parents at the Stork Club in New York City. She looks older than she actually is. At the beginning of production of the spy movie, Conspirator, with Robert Taylor, who was in his late 30s at that time, and Elizabeth, who played Taylor's love interest, was only 17 years old. During this time, Taylor becomes lifelong friends with actor Montgomery Clift. Also in 1948, Liz plays the part of Amy in Little Women, along with June Allison, Peter Lawford, and others. The movie was released the next year in 1949. In 1950, the beautiful 18-year-old actress had just graduated from high school on the MGM lot when she marries Conrad Nicky Hilton Jr. on May the 6th at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills, California. Although Hilton was the heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune, MGM took charge of the expensive wedding and making the most of the publicity for their star. Taylor stated years later that she wanted to marry young so she could get away from her parents and MGM studio. She had always lived a sheltered life and wanted independence. Unfortunately, the fairy tale marriage only lasted a short 8 months. Elizabeth discovered that her husband was a heavy drinker and had become abusive towards his wife. They divorced in January 1951. While married to Hilton, Taylor starred in the critically acclaimed movie A Place in the Sun with her friend Montgomery Clift. She also appeared in Father of the Bride with Spencer Tracy and Joan Bennett. In 1952, MGM began casting her in B movies as punishment for her divorcing Nicky Hilton so soon, believing it would hurt her box office draw, and she became depressed and threatened to quit the movie business entirely. She had been divorced from her first husband 1 year when she married her second husband, British actor Michael Wilding, on February 21st, 1952. Wilding was 20 years older than Liz. They met when she was in England filming Ivanhoe, again with Robert Taylor. With Wilding, she will have 2 sons during their 5-year marriage. Michael Howard will be born January 6, 1953, and Christopher Edward on February 27, 1955. During her marriage to Wilding, she will negotiate a new contract with MGM for $4,700 per week. The studio will lend the newly married couple a loan to buy a house. And now she was entirely dependent on MGM. Taylor negotiated a 3-year contract for Wilding in order to help his career. In 1954, she starred in 2 movies, Rhapsody and Elephant Walk with Dana Andrews. At the end of 1954, she would star with Van Johnson in The Last Time I Saw Paris. Now, during this filming, Elizabeth was pregnant with her second son, Christopher. The studio punished her for taking maternity leave by extending her contract for 1 year. In 1955, Taylor persuaded director George Stevens to let her star with her friends James Dean and Rock Hudson in the epic western Giant. 1 week after James Dean finished filming his part in Giant, he was killed in an automobile accident on the 30th of September, 1955. Now, this picture was taken a short time before his accident. The entire cast of Giant was greatly affected, especially Elizabeth. She had to continue filming her answers and reactions to joint scenes with Dean after his death. She was often ill on the set and causing numerous delays. The next year in 1956, Elizabeth had a spinal disc removed and replaced with donor bone. Also, during the filming of Giant on location in Texas, Elizabeth believed that Wilding was being unfaithful back home in California. They began to grow apart and separated. They eventually divorced in January of 1957. 2 weeks later, after the divorce was final, she marries producer Mike Todd on 2nd February in Acapulco, Mexico. They'll have 1 daughter, Elizabeth Frances, on the 6th of August, 1957. During 1957, she will star in Raintree County with her friend Montgomery Clift. Although she did not like the film, she received her first nomination for an Academy Award. In 1958, when Elizabeth Frances, Liz and Mike's daughter, was 7 months old, and 2 weeks after Taylor had started the filming of one of her most successful films, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof with Paul Newman, her husband Mike Todd boarded the private plane that he had named after Elizabeth, the Lucky Liz, for a testimonial dinner in New York City in order to honor him for his Academy Award in Around the World in 80 Days. Elizabeth wanted to go to the awards ceremonies, but stayed home with a high fever. On their way back from New York on March the 22nd around 1 a.m. in the morning, the Lucky Liz crashed close to Grants, New Mexico. It's believed the wings iced up and it was way overloaded. Todd had tried to get his friend Kirk Douglas to make the trip with him, and Kirk's wife refused to let him go. She felt that the flight was not safe. She was right. Kirk stated that he was still arguing with his wife, Annie, about not letting him go with Todd on the Lucky Liz when they heard on the car radio about the crash. When friends heard the news of the crash, they rushed to Liz and Mike's home at 1330 Schuler Drive in Beverly Hills. Eddie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds were close friends with the Todds. Eddie Fisher stated that the casket of Todd was not open, that the remains were almost unidentifiable. Now this is Liz and her brother Howard at Mac Todd's funeral. There were 3 others on the Lucky Liz: movie writer Art Cohn, pilot Bill Werner, and co-pilot Tom Barkley. Mike Todd was buried in the Beth Aaron Cemetery in Forest Park, Illinois. He was 50 years old. Sometime later, grave robbers broke into Todd's grave. The rumor was that Liz had left diamonds behind in the casket. It was not true. A plastic sack with Todd's remains was located under a tree not far from his grave. He was then buried in an undisclosed location. While friends were trying to console Elizabeth for her loss, the studio was trying to force her back on the set of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. She was only given 3 weeks to mourn Todd's death. She later stated that she actually believed that Maggie the cat helped to keep her from going insane. She also needed the work because her husband had accumulated large debts. Before the filming of the Cat on a Hot Tin Roof was finished, she had become involved with one of Todd's closest friends, Eddie Fisher. The studio used the opportunity to push her next few films. They changed her image from grieving widow to homewrecker. After divorcing Debbie Reynolds, Fisher and Taylor married May the 12th, 1959, at Temple Beth Shalom in Las Vegas. Elizabeth will say later on that she married Eddie due to grief. The publicity fueled by the studio will destroy Eddie Fisher's career. His singing career will suffer and he will lose his weekly television show. He will never be able to recover. Liz and Eddie will remain married for 5 years. During their marriage, Elizabeth will star in Suddenly Last Summer by playwright Tennessee Williams. She will be nominated for Academy Award and win a Golden Globe. She will be paid $500,000 for her part and work with her friend Montgomery Clift. The next year in 1960, she would star in Butterfield 8. She portrayed a high-class call girl. Now, the studio knew that her homebreaker image would serve the part well, and Elizabeth hated the part and knew what the studio was doing by giving her this type parts. She had no choice, but it would be her last film with MGM. She insisted in a sympathetic role in the movie for Eddie Fisher, hoping to improve his image with his public. Although it was not much help to Fisher, it won Elizabeth the Academy Award for Best Actress. After Butterfield 8, Elizabeth began with her new contract under 20th Century Fox. It will be the most expensive picture ever made up until that time, Cleopatra. She'll be paid $1 million and 10% of the profit. It'll take 2 years to complete. It'll start filming in England in the late 1960s. It will be plagued with bad weather and delays. In March of 1961, Elizabeth will become near fatal with pneumonia. It will be necessary to have a life-saving tracheotomy performed. During the filming of Cleopatra, they will move the location from England to Rome, and Elizabeth will begin a romance with her co-star, Richard Burton. Although Elizabeth was still married to her fourth husband, Eddie Fisher, and Burton was married to his first wife, Sybil Williams. Against studio wishes, they will flaunt their romance in public. Cleopatra finished filming in July of 1962. Financially, it was a major flop, and almost driving the studio into bankruptcy. The studio filed suit against Burton and Taylor, claiming that their open romance damaged the film. So in 1963, Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton agreed to make a movie similar to their public romance in order to help make up for the financial losses of Cleopatra. It was called The VIPs. The next year in 1964, Eddie Fisher had been replaced by Richard Burton in Liz's life. After their divorce, Richard and Liz was married March 15, 1964. Through their marriage, the couple will star in 11 movies together. In 1965, they made The Sandpiper, directed by Vincent Minnelli. This is Elizabeth and her brother Howard in 1965, that same year. The next year, in 1966, Taylor receives her second Academy Award for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? And in 1967, Taylor and Burton played in The Taming of the Shrew. Also in 1967, Elizabeth starred without Burton in Reflections in a Golden Eye. Her reason was to try and help her longtime friend, Montgomery Clift. Clift's career had been in decline for years from substance abuse. The studio was afraid to use Clift, so Elizabeth offered to pay his insurance so that they would accept him. Unfortunately, Montgomery Clift died of a heart attack before filming started. Marlon Brando was called in to take his place. In 1968, Francis Lynn Taylor, Liz's father, dies. In 1973, the famous couple did their last movie together, Divorce His, Divorce Hers. And on the 26th of June, 1974, Liz and Dick divorced for real. However, within a year and a half, they will try it again. On the 10th of October, 1975, they'll remarry. Unfortunately, within 9 months, on the 29th of July, 1976, they will again divorce. Richard Walter Jenkins Jr., Richard Burton, will marry 2 more times after Elizabeth. The same year, 1976, he divorced Elizabeth. He marries Susie Miller. They will divorce 6 years later in 1982. The next year, in 1983, he marries Sally Hay. They'll remain married for 1 year until his death on the 5th of August, 1984. 1 year before Burton's death, he will team up with Taylor the last time in a play called Private Lives. The play was a financial success. However, both stars were in bad health. Taylor committed herself to the Betty Ford Drug and Alcohol Rehabilitation Center when the play finished. She was the first celebrity to openly admit she was in treatment. During Elizabeth's marriage to Burton, she accumulated one of the largest privately owned collections of diamonds and jewelry in the world. News media said that Richard Burton appeared to be in good health, but he began feeling ill that morning while staying at his villa just outside of Geneva, Switzerland. He died later that afternoon at a Geneva hospital of cerebral hemorrhage. Richard Burton is buried at a cemetery located near Geneva, Switzerland. Richard Burton was 58 years old. After Elizabeth Taylor divorced Richard Burton in 1976, that same year she marries her sixth husband, Senator Jack Warner of Virginia. They married on December the 4th. While married to Warner, she helps during his election campaign. However, political life in Washington becomes boring, and she begins gaining weight and becomes depressed. She became more dependent on drugs and alcohol. They divorced in November of 1981. 2 years later, in 1983, Elizabeth Taylor acknowledges that she's been addicted to painkillers and sleeping pills for some 35 years, partly because during her lifetime she will undergo 20 major surgeries. And in 1984, she meets Michael Jackson for the first time. They form a lasting relationship. They both had problems with drugs, and both careers were fading. She became a mother figure to Jackson. She felt that she needed to protect her troubled friend. Elizabeth became his staunchest supporter when he was charged with child abuse, and Jackson looked on Elizabeth as a second mother, and she saw him as a troubled son. Also in 1984, she was told by the granddaughter of J. Paul Getty, the billionaire, Eileen Getty, her daughter-in-law, who was married to her son Christopher and mother of her 2 grandchildren, that she had been unfaithful to Christopher and had contracted HIV/AIDS. Expecting Elizabeth to scorn her, Eileen was surprised when Elizabeth showed sympathy and supported her in her fight for life. Taylor was the first celebrity to support AIDS victims. In the beginning, AIDS was only in the gay community. The nation's religions, believing it was a disease brought on by a sinful lifestyle, was slow to force the government to move on the issue. Going against her Hollywood friends and fans, Elizabeth tried to bring the AIDS issue to the forefront. Not until her friend and star Rock Hudson, in July of 1985, announced to the world that he had AIDS, did Elizabeth begin to see any results from her efforts. She stated about Rock, "I always knew he was gay, but I thought he had cancer." The same year, Elizabeth founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research. 3 years later, in 1988, Elizabeth relapsed from her own addiction of alcohol and prescription drugs. She checked herself into the Betty Ford Center for treatment. While there, she meets fellow patient Larry Fortinsky, a truck driver and construction worker. Fortinsky's union paid for his treatments. After a few weeks of treatment, Larry is invited to move into the home with Taylor. The next year, in 1990, Taylor again has a close call with pneumonia, almost dying. She will spend 3 months hospitalized. After her recovery, Elizabeth, the next year, in 1991, will marry her 8th and final time on October the 6th to Larry Fortinsky, who is 20 years younger than Liz. It will be a huge event behind the secured walls of Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch. There will be a prenuptial agreement stating that he will receive $1 million if the marriage lasts 5 years. It lasted 5 years and 25 days. They were divorced on the 31st of October, 1996. Plus the $1 million, she will later give him $50,000 to pay off his house note that he was about to lose. He'll lose it anyway. And in her will, she left him $800,000. The year she married Larry, 1991, she started the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. That same year, she supervised the creation of a line of perfume called White Diamonds. It has been reported that Taylor made more money on her fragrance than all of her movies combined, helping her accumulate a fortune of over $500 million. In June of 1995, Elizabeth will enter a local hospital at an undisclosed location to replace her right hip. 15 months earlier, she had been operated on to replace her left hip. 2 years later, in February of 1997, Elizabeth Taylor will undergo surgery to remove a benign brain tumor. By 2000, Elizabeth rarely attends public functions. Because of back problems, she was confined to a wheelchair. Also in 2000, Queen Elizabeth of Great Britain will honor Elizabeth Taylor with the title of Lady Dane Elizabeth Taylor. In 2004, Elizabeth was diagnosed with heart trouble. She will use a wheelchair for the next 6 years. Now this is Elizabeth with her 4 children, Michael and Christopher Wilding, Marie Burton, and Liza Todd, celebrating Elizabeth's 75th birthday. On the 23rd of March 2011, Elizabeth Rosemont Taylor will pass away at the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles of congestive heart failure. She'll be buried in the mausoleum close to her friend Michael Jackson at the Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. Elizabeth Taylor was 79 years old. At her request, the burial ceremony will start 15 minutes late. For years, she said her friends had been saying that she'd be late for her own funeral. She said she didn't want to make liars out of her friends.